I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Foley Institute here at WSU, and on behalf of the Institute, on behalf of the MLK Committee, who's our partners in bringing this event to you today, I want to welcome you out. Now, this is something I've very much been looking forward to for a long time. I'm glad this is our first event of the semester. We have a terrific speaker tonight, or today. I also, before I get started, want to remind you, Kamau will also be speaking this evening at 6:30 in the junior and senior ballroom in the Cub. So if you want to hear him again, you can go this evening to his MLK address. It's entitled Power Plus Love for this evening. Today, however, he's going to be speaking about comedy and politics and how the two collide, I suppose. He's going to speak for a few minutes, and then he's just going to open it up for a Q&A from all of you. So, W. Kamau Bell is a socio-political comedian who hosts the Emmy Award-winning CNN docuseries United Shades of America. He also recently made his Netflix debut with a new stand-up comedy special, Private School Negro. Kamau has a book out, and it's got a very pithy title. You might want to write this down. The Awkward Thoughts of W. Kamau Bell, Tales of a 6'4" African-American heterosexual, cisgender, left-leaning, asthmatic, black and proud, blurred, mama's boy, dad, and stand-up comedian. Kamau has been nominated for multiple NAACP Image Awards and a GLAAD Award, and he has been featured on Condé Nast's Daring 25 list. Kamau is on the advisory board of Hollaback and Donor's Choice. He's also currently serves as the ambassador for racial justice for the ACLU, and the New York Times has called Kamau the most promising new talent in political comedy in many years. Join me now in welcoming Kamau Bell.
Hi, everybody. This feels like I just didn't expect to walk into. I thought we were walking into another room, and I was like, "Oh, here, hello." Let me step out. I feel awkward sitting here hearing my eulogy. Thank you. My name is W. Kamau Bell. I appreciate all your attempts at pronunciation. Kamau. Let's start there. Kamau is a Kikuyu word for quiet warrior. I am not Kikuyu, but my parents were black in the 70s, and it was very popular to give your kids African names, so that's where I got it. In Kenya, being named Kamau is like being named John over here, so I got to go to Kenya last year. We can talk about that later if we need to. Just to be clear, I'm happy to be on this thing. Power Plus Love, that's not my title. I think that's the title of the event. I have a lot of thoughts about that, but that's I just want to be clear about this is Power Plus Love. Oh, I'm thinking about it now. So, I'm still getting the coffee in me. So, I am a social-political comedian. That's a title that I gave myself at a certain point because people were I would get booked on political comedy shows, and the audiences at political comedy shows weren't happy with what I was doing. So I said, well, I think I'm being political in some way, but I sort of did some research. I came upon the title of socio-political, which means political, but talking about society, not about who's in Congress or all things going on in D.C. I didn't think of myself as growing up politically, but as I said, my parents were activists and active in their community when I was around the time I was born and before, in ways that black people had to be active to survive. I don't think they thought of themselves as activists, but if you just cared about your people's survival in your community, then you sort of became an activist by default. I always joked that I was 11 years old before I realized that cracker was also a delicious snack. That's for the older people. If you don't get that, make a black friend. So I grew up hearing my mom talk about race and racism all the time in our house. And my mom was born in 1937 in Indianapolis, which is like being born in Alabama in 1857. She saw some of this isn't for everybody. She was around for she was there when they integrated the schools. She was around for separate but unequal. She was around for coloreds only this and whites only this. She saw the whole range of America's sort of like institutional structural slavery basically at that point, everything except for slavery. She'd seen everything. She'd been around for everything. All of America's racism is what I'm trying to say. So I grew up hearing her talk about the struggle, but also trying to get a job. And at that point, and it's still the case now, but you couldn't disentangle those two things. My mom got a degree from Indiana University. Everywhere she went, she was the first black person to do whatever. She was the first black person to do it. We've never had a black person walk through this door. You know, it's literally this door, not a lot of metaphor. And so I always heard her talking about blackness. She used to play Martin Luther King Jr. albums in our house. It was just a part of the world I grew up in. I was also a kid who just wanted to be a stand-up comedian. I watched Saturday Night Live, Eddie Murphy, Seinfeld. I just thought that was great. I was an only child. My mom thought I was funny. I thought she had good taste. So I just wanted to be funny. And those two things, I had this, my household of being talking about race and racism all the time. My dad lived in Alabama, so I would take every summer I go to Alabama, which I think is everyone should do if you don't live in Alabama. I think America's narrative of the South a lot of times comes from people who've never been to the South. So, there you go. So I got to see, I would spend time, my mom moved us around a lot. So we were in Indianapolis, we were in Chicago, we were in Boston, and I'm going every summer to Alabama. And the thing I was finding out is I would go to Alabama, and they'd be like, you don't talk like you're from here. And I'd go back to Boston, and they're like, you don't talk like you're from here. And so I sort of developed a sense of like not really fitting in anywhere. And especially as an only child. So as I started doing comedy, I just wanted to be funny. I just was trying to be funny the way I'd seen my comedic heroes be funny. Chris Rock, all these people, Margaret Cho, people I just seen being funny. I was like, I just want to be funny. But I kept getting pulled to tell jokes about race and racism. And I would notice that when I told those jokes, the crowd would sort of listen for a little bit, and after a while, I'd be like, that's enough of that. So my whole early part of my career was struggling with how much do I talk about race and racism? How much do I just talk about things that comedians think are funny? And I sort of went back and forth. And then 2007 happened. The junior senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, decided to run for president. I don't know if you remember that back that far, everybody. I think at the time, most of us, even black folks, were like, oh, that's cute, a black guy's running for president. Good for him. Maybe he can be vice president if he's lucky. But as I was doing comedy at that time, he was in the news all the time, and a lot of discussions about race and racism that had been just behind closed doors with black people and people of color were now on the evening news. And the ways in which he was being talked about, and the way they were covering him, and the questions they were asking him, and I just started to take that stuff on stage. And at that point is when people started to say I was a political comedian. You know, and I think and at some point realized, oh, if you're black and have an opinion, you're political. So it wasn't something that I was explicitly going out to do, but I found out that I was suddenly in these circles where I do these political comedy shows. But because I wasn't talking about the left and the right, I was talking about inclusion, I was talking about identity, I was talking about structural racism. I didn't fit into these political comedy shows. So I started to write my own show, which I'm going to do a version of tonight, called the W. Kamau Bell Curve, Ending Racism in About an Hour. And I had a special gimmick at the show, because I was like, if I do this show, how do I get to make sure I have the right people in the room? So we had a gimmick where if you brought a friend of a different race, you got in 2 for 1. Which confused and angered some people, but they came to the show anyway. So at that point, I was able to really focus on race and racism and talk about the things I wanted to talk about and not do the other material that I didn't believe in. At that point, I'd done it for a couple years. At some point, Chris Rock hears about the show. He sneaks into the back one night when I was in New York and watches the show. I'd never met him before. Then he comes backstage, and within a couple months, he says, I'm going to help you get a TV show. He's like, unfamous black guys never get TV shows. Unfamous white guys get TV shows all the time. But if you want a TV show, you're going to need my help. And I said, I'll take your help, Chris Rock, because I'm not dumb. Nah. That show ended up being a show called Totally Biased, which was on FX and FXX. And it was an attempt to do a Daily Show style late night talk show, but about race, racism, and culture. It lasted a year, so it was not a very successful attempt. But out of that, and I had not had enough TV experience to do it. I had not had enough producing experience. I was pretty early to the market. The thing that I'm really proud of about that show is that even though the show didn't last, we put people on that show who then went on to have who have had big careers. We were the first time Trevor Noah was on TV. I think we gave Issa Rae her first on-camera interview on that show. We had Hannibal Buress on before he took down Bill Cosby. I had other things, and he was in Angry Birds too. We did all these things, and we booked all these people on. I was close friends with Hassan Minaj. We were trying to figure out how to get him on the show at the time, and I've seen all these things happen through our show. That even though the show didn't work, I felt like we were just a little bit early to the market of these kind of shows you see now with Samantha Bee, Hassan Minaj, even John Oliver's show is a more pushed version of The Daily Show. And at the time when the show got canceled, as much as I didn't feel that, I just needed a job. Like I had a wife and a baby, and my wife was pregnant, living in New York City, paying $7,000 a month in rent. Yeah, for an apartment for a guy who was a TV star. And I was no longer a TV star. And at that point, I started to book meetings to try to figure out what my next move was going to be. And most of the meetings ended up being with like news outlets. And it was, again, the first time I saw myself as like, oh, people really see me as someone who's capable of synthesizing the news in a fun way. And that's my thing that I do. And then I was like, well, I have to figure out if I'm going to talk to these people, how do I do that in here? And so I had a meeting at CNN, and they pitched me an idea for a show. They had called Black Man, White America, where a black man would travel around the country going to white places. And I said, I would not do that. I already have white in-laws. I know what white people do. Thank you, lady over here. Thank you. I appreciate it. And so that idea transformed into United Shades of America, a more inclusive idea about traveling around the country to places where to hear from voices we wouldn't normally hear from in the news media. But famously, the first episode we did, which was the pilot, was the Ku Klux Klan. So I went and talked to the Ku Klux Klan in Dawson Springs, Kentucky, and where else was that? Oh, Harrison, Arkansas. Got to go to a cross burning. It's okay, everybody. I'm safe. So, and it was the idea for me of doing that show was, can I hold my humanity in talking to these people who hate me or worse? Can I be myself? Can I be funny in a way that is not self-deprecating, but is actually just making fun out of what they're saying and making them laugh about the things they're saying? And at the time, I didn't know if it was going to be a TV show. It was just a pilot, which is just one episode. If it goes well, then it turns into a TV show. So I didn't know if it was going to go on. I was like, well, at least if it doesn't become a TV show, I'll have a good story I can tell. And it did become a TV show, and right now we're working on our 5th season of the show. And throughout the years on the show, we've covered a lot of communities that I didn't know anything about. We've talked about subjects on TV that I feel like we weren't hearing enough about. One of our episodes that we did, which won the Emmy, was an episode about the Sikh community in Yuba City, and it was a whole community and a whole religion that I knew very little about, and I just sort of walked in and was just like, just explain this to me. And the thing about that show that was so great was that we worked closely with the Sikh community to make sure we covered the things they thought was important, and also that I got the pronunciation as close to right as possible. So it was a way in which I was like, oh, we have to really connect to these communities, and I have to make sure as a producer, because I am an executive producer, one of the greatest things Chris Rock did for my career is that he made me an executive producer on my first show. So now whatever show I go to, I'm an executive producer, which is way bigger than being on TV. I think a lot of times people get confused about being on TV as the goal, but those faces get replaced very quickly. But if you can be a producer, producers can work forever. And also if you're a talent and producer, you have control over the words that are coming out of your mouth, or at least you're supposed to. Sometimes you have to fight for that and remind people that you're a producer. Which I'll talk to the black people about in a separate meeting. Is he serious? I don't know. This is strange. I don't know. He's one brother we can know. And the idea being that the show that I'm trying to do and that we're working towards, and it doesn't happen every week, is a show that not only reflects the community and what's going on, but is informative to the people who know nothing, but it's helpful to the people who know everything. So the people who know nothing walk out going, I didn't know anything about this thing. I know how to talk about this better. But the people who are members of that community, they go, finally something I can point to for people who know nothing, so I don't have to have those conversations on the bus or at the airport or at college in class. I can point and say, no, don't ask me about why I'm wearing whatever I'm wearing. Go watch this show. And also we've been able to cover things that are really important to me personally in ways that I don't think they normally get covered on television. So, whenever there's issues in the news I get frustrated by, like it was a couple years ago, Trump was running for president and talking about how Chicago was like a gang-ridden, whatever he said. I don't know. He tweets so much. Yesterday, he broke his own record. I think it's a cry for help personally. But so I was like, how do we? I used to live in Chicago, went to high school in Chicago. Let's go do an episode about gangs in Chicago. Even though, because as a Chicagoan, I didn't grow up around gangs, so I knew it wasn't as bad as he said it was. But also, let's talk to the guys who are actually in gangs, the young guys who are new in gangs, and the older guys who've been around gangs. And for me, that was an episode where it was like, it makes me uncomfortable to go do this, but if I don't do this, who's going to do this the way that I do this? And the thing that's important to me is to bring humor into all these situations so that it's not just didactic, it doesn't feel like journalism. I am not a journalist, I'm still a comedian on my tax forms. So it's important for me to bring laughter into these things, or else it can just wash over people quite quickly. My favorite moment ever from the history of the show was in the second season. We did an episode and I'll take questions. We did an episode at Standing Rock, and we did part of the episode at Pine Ridge, or Indian Reservation. Did I lose you? I'm sorry. At Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So we went to the Indian Reservation, we talked to people, and we were talking about poverty on Pine Ridge and how things are going there. And somebody said, you know who you need to talk to? There's this couple whose son was just killed by gang violence a couple days ago. There's a memorial service at their house right now. I will call them and see if they'll let you come over, because they would have a lot to say about what life is like on the Indian Reservation. And I was like, there's a memorial service at their house right now? They said, yes. I said, we can be there in a half hour. And I was like, I don't want to do that. How am I, a comedian who dropped out of college, going to go to this memorial service and ask them questions about their lives in the middle of their grief? But we talked about it. They said they were open to it. So I walked into that situation and just sort of did the best I could do to just hold the space, be respectful, and let them say what they wanted to say. And I talked to them about their son's murder, and I talked to them about the problems living on the reservation. We talked about the government, how the government treats Native people. And the best moment that I think in the show's history, as far as I'm concerned, we were having this real deep conversation, and the mom said, you know why the government doesn't treat Native people well? I was like, I don't know why. And I was waiting for her answer. I thought I was waiting for a real thick and detailed answer. She goes, because we kicked Custer's ass. And I laughed, and she laughed, and all the people in the room who were mourning laughed. And I was like, that's the show. Out of this moment of deep grief and deep pain, laughter comes through. Because as all of us know who are oppressed people of color, openly gay people, trans folk know, that if you don't laugh, you're going to destroy yourself. If you don't find ways to process this pain, you're going to eat yourself up from the inside. And so for me, that's the purpose of what I do. That's the life of the show. All the work I do is about that. It's pretty thick work sometimes. It can get pretty frustrating, but I know I'm in the privileged position because I'm the one who's receiving the information. I'm not going through these things. So this season on the show, we're sort of continuing that narrative and pushing conversations. We have a conversation. We're doing a show about public schools in Cleveland. We have a show about white supremacy, which I feel like every show of our show is about white supremacy, but whatever. We have a show about reparations in New Orleans, and among other shows. I can't remember what the other shows are right now. Kelly? Homelessness in homelessness in LA. What else? Venezuelan Americans. So yeah, just some light stuff, It's like a Seinfeld episode. And I feel like my goal is to plunge deeply into these issues, even things like Venezuela, where I'm like, I follow those conversations on Twitter. That nobody wins in those conversations on Twitter, but it feels like it's my job and my goal to go deep into these conversations and to see if we can get some clarity so that all of us basically can have smarter conversations. The people that say, what's the goal for the show? Is the goal for the show world peace and to end all wars? Yes. But at the very basic level, that starts with smarter, better conversation. So I'm just trying to change your dinner party conversations and your bus conversations and your class conversation. And if I can give you more information so you can have that smarter conversation, then mission accomplished. So thank you. I'll take some questions.
We've got a little over half an hour for Q&A. Maybe I'll start us off.
Okay.
So there's different kinds of political comedy, and some of it's not very personal, about partisan politics and stuff like that. But you do really personal stuff.
Yeah.
And it really taps into identity and sometimes really painful issues on both sides. So do you see limits to your comedy, or how do you draw those lines, or do you?
I mean, there's a lot of talk right now about can there be comedy in the world, and can the world be funny, and are comedians being canceled and censored and blah 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 blah. Every comedian has their lines they won't cross. Every comedian has the subjects they like to talk about. The thing that's happening now is that we're all having all the conversations are being had at once. So you can be on Twitter having a conversation about public schools, and then something comes across your feed about a comedian said a thing, and now you're having that conversation. So the thing that I think comedians have to be aware of is that everything we say, everything I say in this room, can potentially go somewhere, and somebody can go, "What did you mean by that? What did he mean by that? I would like to cancel him for that." I think that's whatever. I don't believe that cancel culture is a thing. So I feel like as comedians, we're all trying to say things we shouldn't be saying, which is why we're comedians. So that's the cost we pay, is that we sometimes step over the line. I think comedians are sort of basically paid to step over the line sometimes, and then we have to deal with the consequences. There's many comedians who are saying horrible things that I would not vote for and I don't agree with, but they're prepared. They deal with the consequences. So I don't want all comedians to be doing what I do. For me, the line is always checking in with my family, specifically my wife. Starts a lot of stuff with things like, am I saying something about us that you don't want out there in the world? I would like to be able to continue to go home. So then the other line is this joke or this point I'm making stepping on a group of people who need support and not to be stepped on? That's a lesson I learned about 10 years ago about you can't make fun of this group you can't punch up by punching down. You can't make fun of somebody up here by comparing them to a group down here. So for me, part of the thing is like trying to make sure that I'm always educating myself. I'm always accepting legitimate criticism from people who are saying you said this, but that's not how it felt, or you think you said this, but this is what I heard. And also just being okay with taking that feedback. So for me, the line is like making sure, and I had a Netflix special about a year and a half ago, and I was sort of trying to make sure that everything I'm saying in here, I feel like if it blows up and somebody tries to cancel me, I'm just like, yeah, if you want to cancel me for that, that's fine. So I think it's important to, I think it's fine for comedians to just tell jokes that they don't mean. I think that's fine. But I think it's also, comedians have to be aware of the fact that once the words leave your mouth, you don't necessarily control where they go. So that's my answer to that question.
The lady in the corner.
Lady.
Hey, I lived in Indianapolis in the 90s. I'm not sure how much it's changed.
Yeah. I think the restaurants are better now
Yeah, it's true.
than 1937.
So I love your message. It's an awesome message. And I also like that you're trying to bring information to people as well as humor. But as we all know, we're in this period when we're all in our bubbles, in our information bubbles, and there's just so much politicization of truth and information. And I just was wondering, how do you see overcoming that and getting your message across so that we get beyond this bubble stuff? Because it's we had another speaker here who was also in touch with like all the cutting edge race issues. What was his name?
I'm from Candy.
Yeah, and he had that. He brought up the bubble issue, and how hard it is, to get beyond that. So I was just curious about your thoughts.
I mean, I think some of that starts with getting yourself out of your own bubble, breaking yourself out of your own comfort zone. I think that if you're always preaching to the converted, then you're just sort of straightening the bubble. I don't think there's anything wrong with bubbles. We all live in them. We all live in our parts of the country, or many of us have picked a part of the country we want to live in for a reason. Like, that's where I feel the best, So for me, I'm like, I like the racism of the Bay Area better than the racism of Chicago. It's just something about it. It's just a little bit more easy to more manageable. So for me, it's like some of us are purposely living in bubbles, and some of us are just born into circumstances where we can't get out of that thing. But I think all of us, because we have all this information now, have the ability to step outside of our bubbles and to also purposefully reach into other conversations, knowing that this is not where we normally go. But in that moment, you have to be okay with not talking so much. Like, if you're going to talk to somebody who thinks differently politically than you do, the thing you can't do in that conversation, if you want to make any change happen, is just wait to talk. You say your thing. Wait. Now I got one for you. So I think a lot of times we're trying to score high points, especially on Twitter and or on social media. And I feel like we have to get better at like the thing about United Shades. Most of what I'm doing is just listening. And even if I don't agree with somebody, I think we have to get beyond I don't agree with you, so I need to say something, and just sort of like the more you let people talk and get it out of their system, then you can get to who they are as a human and outside of the first few talking points. So for me, it's about like purposefully getting outside of your bubble. You know, I think that the Anki Bourdain show, Parts Unknown, were about parts unknown to him, not parts unknown to the people where he was going. And so for me, I think you can do that in this city, in this town. You can sort of go, I'm going to go to this room instead of this room. I'm going to sit at this table instead of this table. I'm going to go talk, I'm going to sit in the back of the classroom instead of the front of the classroom. Whatever it is, we can all venture out to parts unknown in our life, but then be a willing listener and be a willing participant. And also know that change, if you're trying to change somebody's mind, it's not going to happen in one conversation, two conversations. It may never happen, but the point is if you're engaged in the work, you have to be willing to do the work over a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
So, as a comedian, what are your thoughts about people who are public figures who say things like, I wasn't being, clearly so-and-so was making a joke to deflect criticism because they say, oh, it's a joke, you can't, he wasn't being serious, he didn't mean that tweet, get over it, you need to get a sense of humor. But these people are public figures, they don't get paid money to make, Netflix specials.
I think everybody can be held accountable to their words, but I think there's also important about the context. So if a comedian says, something that is offensive, I think they should be held to the standards of comedians saying offensive things, which is different than a president saying something that's offensive. I don't think I was just joking as a defense for even a comedian. Because if nobody laughs at your joke, then it wasn't a joke. A joke only exists for the response. And even if the people in front of you laugh, if the world doesn't laugh, then it ceases to be a joke. And I think so for me, when people say I was just joking, well, the fact you had to say that proves that it wasn't a good joke. So I think that everybody should be can be held accountable for their words. But again, I think sometimes acting like what a comedian says in a comedy club is as significant as what a president says in a press conference or on Twitter. Those are not the same thing. So I think that certainly context has to come into play. And I'm not saying that, there's the guy I'm not saying there can't be consequences for comedians. There was a guy who got fired. He got hired and then fired from Saturday Night Live because he was on a podcast saying a bunch of nonsense about Asian people that didn't make any sense. But for me, it was like, first of all, every comedian's like, that's not a joke. There's no joke structure there. And second of all, yeah, you take the consequences for your actions. You said these things. That's not what Saturday Night Live wants to represent them. So now you don't have a job. So I think everybody can be held accountable. I just don't think that, literally, if a comedian's on stage and says that I was kidding, then something's gone really wrong. And if a politician says it, then something's gone really, really wrong. And I think that, that's not a defense for things that offend people. Yes, and then you.
The first episode of United States or United Shades of America.
Yeah. Or United Shades of Grey, as people call it.
Yeah. Is there anything funny that was in that tape that didn't get on the broadcast? Or?
He has a lot of stuff. It's, you shoot for we were at the Klan cross burning for 4 hours.
Oh.
Yeah. There was a lot of things that if I didn't have I was a producer on the show, but at that point I was not given a lot of power to produce. If I had the power to do that show, I would edit it very differently. Because there was a lot of just extra stuff that we just weren't able to get in. But yeah, so there's a lot of things that I'm trying to think of specific moments. I'm trying to think of specific moments. It's been a long time since I shot that, and I've blacked most of it out. But no, there was a lot. There was just a lot of when I was at the cross burning. At some point, the guys who decided to talk to me sort of just had to let their guard down because we had been there for so long, and there was just a lot of It was weird at some point. I felt it's kind of like we're doing like a PBS show for this old Klansman, because they're just telling me how this stuff works. They're just sort of really going, well, we get the cross and we you don't want to get that kind of work. And it was, to me, it was so funny because it was if they were going to talk for that long, they had to let the hate, they had to let the down, which they had at the beginning, and then it just becomes dudes talking about woodworking and the best ways to set things on fire, and it was. And one of those moments is in the show because he was the one guy he was getting frustrated by. He was asking for Klansman to get him bring him some rags or something, some kerosene soaked rags, and he was hell, he was getting frustrated. I was like, what do we have to do to get a Klansman to come over here? Just for me as a black guy saying that was so funny to me. How do we get it? And so for me, once the hatred sort of melted away, just the basic humanity as being funny came through in a way that felt like a sitcom, and I think the producers didn't like that because it felt like we weren't going to be afraid enough of the Klan, and I was like, they're already the Klan. I think we've covered the scary part, and also we've seen plenty of images of them being scary. How about some of them being ridiculous? I think so. For me, that was those moments like that were the ones I really had a good time with. Yeah. Then I got right there.
Yeah. So you talked. I'm on Twitter a lot too, by the way. You talked a bit about cancel culture, and you said, I don't remember if you said you don't believe in that. Can you kind of
I don't believe it's as ubiquitous as people think it is.
Okay.
Louis C.K. is on tour right now. He was allegedly canceled. Who else? I mean, there's any number of, Woody Allen is still somewhere suing Amazon for money. There's any number of, Kevin Spacey is now posting weird Christmas videos every once a year to creep us out. Basically posted a threat and then one of the witnesses died. Okay. I don't believe Harvey Weinstein is still eating in nice restaurants, hanging out in New York City. I don't believe that cancel culture is as ubiquitous as we think it is. I think cancel culture is actually worse for anonymous people. When somebody you've never heard of does something and the entire internet piles on them, I think those people are probably still feeling canceled in some way. But people of privilege, it is super. I mean, Bill Cosby's still tweeting. I think the idea of canceling people is way overstated, especially celebrities. I think it's way overstated. The guy who was on SNL who got fired for the podcast where he talked about Asian Go, the white guy, his name was bigger after that. He was posting, I'm doing this show now, I'm doing this show. I'm sure his agents were like, we're going to make this work. So I think the idea of cancel culture is way overstated. I don't think there's any evidence that it is as effective as we think it is, as people think it is. Yes.
So I'm asking this question through the lens of the Richmond gun rally that happened earlier this week or last week, can't remember exactly. So the event was largely peaceful, and most of the people there were regular old gun-owning people. But it was also an event where there was this huge confluence of white supremacist militias, and the FBI intercepted multiple white supremacists who were going to this event with the express intent of sparking race war. So in situations like this, where does comedy, conversation, civility fit in? I
mean, I almost went, so that I would have found that out if we were talking about me going to that. Then my wife weighed in. I mean, it just didn't work out. So I was going to go to that. We were sort of looking into that, but it also became clear at some point, there's better ways to spend our time. But I'm sure that, there was a rally in Berkeley that they did. The alt-right was for a little while showing up in Berkeley every few weeks to sort of establish that they could come take over Berkeley. And at first Berkeley didn't take it seriously, so they showed up. And Berkeley was like, I don't know what you're doing. We're at yoga class, So, but then over time they kept showing up. So then Berkeley, Oakland, Richmond, all sorts of people from California, all the surrounding cities showed up to say you're not welcome here. And I went, and it was a great time. I would imagine a lot of people who went to that Richmond thing showing up can feel innervating and great. Doesn't mean it's not scary. Doesn't mean violence doesn't happen. But that sense of intensity is a great fertile ground for conversation. That sense of we're here to show up and do something is a fertile ground for conversation, and conversation can lead to comedy. So I'm sure there were a lot of good conversations that day that if I were there, I would have tried to find them and be a part of them. I think that if humanity wouldn't be here, especially the most oppressed groups wouldn't be here if they weren't finding humor through pain. I think if you look at the history of comedy in this country, generally it is the most oppressed group that is being the funniest. So I think that there's no reason to think that situations people get serious. How are we going to be funny in this serious situation? Well, people find laughter everywhere, and I think it's important to recognize that, because I think sometimes laughter gets sort of diminished as being an important factor of humanity, and I think it's actually probably the unifying factor of humanity. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
If I could
follow
Sure.
up.
I felt I could look at the litter face like that's not it. All right.
I'm also just thinking that like the right-wing extreme groups are becoming more organized and they're hoarding more firearms.
Mhm.
At what point is there something to be done more than conversation to stop this kind of extremism?
I mean, there's also people on the other side who are becoming more organized. I think the problem right now is we have a sort of a, I don't know what's the word I look at. It's like everything stops in Washington. So there's all sorts of public, Oakland just, there's all sorts of public will for more background checks and things like this, and for gun safety regulations. The public will is inside. It's just we have to figure out how to move the roadblock of DC in national politicians. I think so. My dad. I would talk to my dad at some point when Trump was elected, and there started to be all this sort of like news and white supremacy and hate crimes. And my dad's from Alabama. He's like, we got through Alabama in the '60s. So I think those of us who are prisoners to the moment because we're here and we've never seen this before are a little more afraid of like, how do we get through this? And if you talk to older people, they're like, we've gotten through some shit. So I think a lot of times talking to those people in your community who have been through that, and then also really taking it upon yourself to become engaged in the communities that are doing the work. There's lots of gun regulation and gun sense. Gun sense is one of them. Moms demand gun control. There's lots of organizations to be involved in. I think sometimes we get caught up in like, what can I do? Well, you can actually do something. There's many ways to sort of, the Parkland students. There's many ways to check in and to figure out ways to show up or to donate money or time to groups to help the fight. I think getting caught up in like they're more organized than we are is actually you're falling for the okie doke. They want you to feel that way. Was that better that time?
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you.
Yes.
Yes.
Why is it just mostly?
Yeah, I know. I was noticing the pattern too.
Yeah.
So you can skip to him first. If you want.
Okay, let's go. He's using his white privilege to. I assume you're white. I don't mean to judge you.
Oh, no. Wait until you learn my name.
Yeah.
So, first off, I'm a huge fan of your show.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Charleston, your show on Charleston. So, I'm from North Carolina, and that used to be still is one of our favorite vacation destinations.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you filmed your episode of Charleston, like the entire city just changed to me. Like everything that I didn't notice, I noticed.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to go back because that was one of my favorite episodes.
Oh, thank you.
To sort of kind of find out your creative process behind that one episode. Maybe you can shine some light on what that episode was about.
Okay. So that episode was the sort of the pull for that episode is about the Gullah Geechee community in Charleston, who are descendants of enslaved folks who, because they lived on islands there, got to really sort of black folks who got to develop their own culture and got to hold on to a lot of African traditions in ways that black folks who were living on the mainland did not get to do. And because when after slavery ended, white people were like, we better get off these islands. We're surrounded. So black folks got to hold on to traditions and develop their own, and sort of hold on to a culture, a West African culture that black people in the rest of the country have tried to do, but haven't been able to keep as many authentic pieces of it. So we went there to sort of look at it, but of course, these are islands. They're on the water. They're beautiful. They're, of course, being gentrified and worse, being turned into resorts. So it's people who have owned land since the end of slavery who are now getting their land taken from them a lot of times because they don't really have deeds to the property. They don't really have leases, and because it's all been passed down through families. And so when somebody says we're interested in buying this land, who owns it? And nobody can really prove it because it was like, well, my great passed it down to them, and my great passed it down to them. So nobody knows, and so the land gets taken. And so it's talking about how like that story of gentrification happens all over the country, of course, as you know, but then sort of seeing it there in a different way, that we're going to lose one of the most unique cultures in this country, because as we all know, if you travel in the country, every place kind of starts to look the same now. And so it seems to me it was about like how to protect this particular culture in the same ways that like indigenous people talk about protecting their culture in this country. So, and then from that, it also became about like, I don't know, something like 70% or higher of black folks 70% of black folks in the country can chase some of their DNA back to Charleston because that's where a lot of the slave ships landed. So it was telling that story too. So a lot of times with the show, we go in to tell one story, and it becomes like, oh, we got to tell this, and how do we balance these things out? And so that was that. And we had Julie Dash, who was the writer-director of Daughters in the Dust. This is a great independent movie I recommend everyone see. And you get to talk about like a powerful black woman who made one of the most successful independent movies of all time at the height of the independent film movement, and then basically never worked again too much. I didn't get the opportunities that white male filmmakers would get to make 10 movies and then try to step on Bruce Lee's legacy in Once Upon a Time in America. Quentin Tarantino, sorry. So it sort of keeps branching out into other stories, but the central story was about a culture in this country that most people don't know anything about, that is then losing its foothold because of the structures of white supremacy that make it harder for them to trace their land, because at the time they got their land, they weren't considered humans, So, and I think that that's the sort of the story about behind We Did It, how is that we look into, we should go talk about the Gullah Geechee culture. And a lot of the stories come from other producers on the show or people who reach out to us. And so that was what the initial start was. And then from that, you start to build out the rest of it. And then we got to talk about the museum they're building there, which that was a funny part of the show we didn't get to include. We were filming with, what was his name? His name was like Michael Moore. He's a black man named Michael Moore. It's like he's got a name of a white man. Michael Moore. A famous black man, not any, but anyway. So Michael Moore, who's who's building this museum there, we were having this conversation, and it's just on a flat, grassy field where people walk and probably have lunch and walk their dogs, but it's going to be a museum, and so he's talking about it's going to be here and doing this and doing this, and, and some white lady with a dog is like, "What are you doing here?" Like, dealing with America's structures of racism. Talking about the history of racism in this country. What would you like us to do? So it was just one of those. I was like, I wish we could have included it, because it was just this. Like we were clearly standing there filming. We had huge film cameras, and yet she wanted to know. I need to see some permits. Okay. So stuff like that happens on the show all the time. But yeah, so does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So 4 years ago, I was kind of getting into podcasts, and one of my favorite ones was Politically Reactive.
Yes.
About the presidential election back then, and I was kind of sad when it stopped having new episodes, and all I was left with was like Pod Save America. It's good for what it is, but I kind of noticed after the election and inauguration of Donald Trump that a lot of national comedy became a bit more introspective in terms of, I don't know if this was actually an observed or an actual effect, but it seemed like there was a lot of kind of looking in towards, more introspective, kind of more thoughtful ways to use comedy to approach serious issues, because there was a lot of wild screaming going on for the last 4 years. And I was just wondering, like, with the new presidential election coming up this year, do you notice kind of a cycle in the style of comedy in terms of how people address materials?
As a comedian who works in political arenas, like this is our Super Bowl year, or this is our Olympics. Like every comedian is going to be political this year. So the challenge is for those of us who are always doing this work to sort of rise above the easy jokes. So everybody's going to be talking about this, and also because it's actually an Obama thing. Obama made the president a pop culture figure, so then we elected a pop culture figure. So now every show, like Jimmy Fallon's show, doesn't do as well as it used to because people actually sort of want to hear about what's going on in the world. He's going to be fine, everybody. Don't worry. Don't cry for Jimmy Fallon. It's funny. I think that, but I don't. I think there's more platforms available to comedians, so you're seeing more types of comedians than you used to see. I think, as my friend Boots Riley talks about, you kind of only see the algorithm that you have pointed at you sometimes. So there are plenty of comedians who are still out there going screaming, like wildly screaming, like you said. It's just you may have started to sort of get the algorithm to point you towards the ones who are not doing that. I think it is interesting that like the biggest comedy specials of the last 10 years, or I don't know what's the biggest one before that. I think the biggest comedy special since Bring the Pain was Hannah Gadsby's special, as far as like a special that everybody talked about. Yeah. When Chris Rock Bring the Pain came out, everybody talked about it. Everybody had an opinion on it, whether they wanted to or not. And Hannah Gadsby's special, Nanette, was like that too. Yeah. And then behind that is Ali Wong's special, Baby Cobra. Like, and these are specials that are like, in some sense, political, but not political the way we think of political comedy. Not like Louis Black political, and Louis Black is hilarious, but like political through identity and through claiming space for who you are in the world. Ali Wong is I'm a half Vietnamese, half Chinese, very pregnant lady who has a filthy mouth, and Hannah Gadsby is I'm a person queer person who has feelings about how I'm seen in the world, and I'm not going to stop letting them out. So I think that I think it's interesting to think that those are the biggest specials, even though lots of big comedians have put out specials. I mean, I think Dave Chappelle also seems to have his specials have moments, but Hannah Gadsby's had a sustain that I hadn't seen another special have. And it's not about the quality of the specials; it's about how the specials hit the culture. So, but there's also like, I can give you lots of comedians who are just out there wildly screaming if you want to watch them. And I'm not saying those are bad. I'm just saying those are what they are. You know, there's I mean, there's a whole crew of like sort of, and these are funny comedians. It's not like Bert Kreischer, Crystalia. Joe Rogan's a little bit not that, but there are certainly still white dude comedians talking about white dude comedy things, So good for them. It's a fun time we hear from them. But and I think some of them are funny, so I'm not saying that. But I do think that there's also just more platforms for comedy. It used to be like the HBO special, then it was like the Netflix special, and now Amazon, HBO, Netflix, apparently. NBC's going to get into. There's just a lot more avenues and venues for that. So I think that which is for me as a kid who grew up wanting to be a comedian because of Eddie Murphy and SNL. I could not have imagined having a show on CNN. That was not a thing that was open to me. So I think it's the venues and the number of outlets that are bigger. So there's more comedy. Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
What do you think is the best way to build communications with people that are not welcoming to you, like the KKK, like break the initial barrier?
I mean, everybody doesn't got to talk to the KKK. I'm clear. There's just, you can start with like lower levels of problematic white people than that. I think that patience is the number one way. I think a lot of times not going in with the agenda of like, I'm here to debate you, I'm here to change your mind. I think I'm here to hear you and try to understand where you're coming from. And then also, and when I feel like when you have gotten to a point where you are ready for me to speak, then I will start to make some points. So I think it's patience. I think lots of people think these things are going to happen in one conversation, and it's not going to be one conversation. It's got to be several. It's got to be an ongoing thing. So I think the number one thing is patience and whatever the bravery it takes to start the conversation. A lot of times people want to have that conversation, but they're not ready to. They get so caught up in starting it that they never start. So I think actually like saying, I'm going to do it now, I think for me is the biggest thing. And also, hearing things you don't want to hear just because it's important to know what's out there. A lot of times people say, why did you put Richard Spencer on your show? You gave him a platform. Because a lot of people didn't know he was out there, and a lot of people are caught up in their bubbles. And it's like, so for part of the United Shades, it's like every week I'm trying to break somebody's bubble open. So I think that's, be okay hearing things you don't want to hear if you're trying to get to a deeper truth or a deeper connection. Yes.
What's your best Trump joke?
My best Trump joke? You can see several of them on my Netflix special, Private School Negro. I'd say that special is 65 minutes. There's probably 45 minutes of Trump jokes in there. I'm not working on any Trump jokes now, but maybe I'll have an idea. So I think my best Trump jokes are probably behind me. I think the thing about right now is knowing the election is going to happen in November. There's more interesting things to do before then, except write Trump jokes. But stream my special Private School Negro on Netflix. Plenty of good Trump jokes that still, even though it was 2018, still seem to be relevant. It's funny how that works. Yes.
Given everything you've accomplished so far in your career, do you still see that you are pursuing your own interests in terms of what you hope to accomplish, or what still society is kind of expecting out of you as a public figure?
I mean, that's the thing. Every person who's in the spotlight navigates, like, what choices am I making for myself versus what choices do I feel like people are expecting me to make. I just had a phone call earlier today, and I was like, everything I'm working on right now is so horrible. And I don't mean like the work is horrible, but it's like these are big issues involving oppression and racism and structural inequity and da-da-da. And I was like, I wish I could just be Daniel Tosh. It's just like, but I also know that it's a privilege to be on this side of the thing. It wasn't that long ago that I was sitting sort of, how do I get there? And so I also know that I have to make the most of the moment. And I also know that for my family, it's important we put work out in the world that my family can respect, so when they hear about it, they can support it. So, and this is the stuff that I'm interested in talking about. Sometimes I wish there wasn't so much of it to talk about, but Yeah, I mean, one of the struggles we had with Politically Reactive was that because the work, it was called Politically Reactive, we kind of couldn't talk about things that weren't explicitly political. And me and Hari, my co-host Hari Kondabolu, were like, I just want to talk about basketball. And so we always joke about having a basketball podcast. So I am trying to find ways, even through podcasting, to open up what people expect for me to talk about so I can talk about more things. Because it can be sometimes, it is a privilege to be bummed out by the things to talk about because other people don't have the microphone. So I understand, it's like this sort of, I'm not going to complain, it is so hard to be a comedian talking about oppression. Like, that's not a thing I'm going to say seriously. Because I know that the talking about it is easier than the dealing with it. So, but yes, I certainly often am looking for opportunities to do things that are just fun. Or things that are just, and some of that I do sort of quietly, like, a couple weeks ago in Oakland, I had reached out to Steve Kerr's people. Steve Kerr's the coach of the Golden State Warriors. About would Steve be interested in having a conversation with me on stage, and we'll give the proceeds to a charity who wants to support a local charity. And they came back and said yes. And so I got to ask Steve Kerr about like stuff that I knew the world cares about, like Iran and his dad being assassinated and his battles with Trump on Twitter. And I got to ask him Michael Jordan stories that I wanted to hear about. So for me it was a funny because it's like I get to actually, I want to hear about that other stuff too, but there's also stuff that I want to hear about because I'm just me. So for me, I always try to find ways to navigate that. But yeah, yes.
Clarification: was that the son of Soleimani? Or
Huh?
Who did you interview? I didn't catch that.
Oh, Steve Kerr.
Oh, Steve Kerr.
Steve Kerr is the coach of the Golden State Warriors, who people don't realize his dad was assassinated by Hezbollah. So he has a lot of and his dad was an expert on the Middle East. So Steve Kerr has a lot of Middle East experience and knowledge, and lived overseas when he was a kid. So
okay,
and so yeah, and he also played with Michael Jordan. So he's got a lot of things to talk about. Yes, over here, sir.
Good. You earlier mentioned working with gangs outside Chicago.
Doing an episode, I don't want to overstate it.
My question was simply to ask you really about your sense of Spike Lee's comedy, of what he did trying to
Talking about Chirac?
Yeah.
I mean, Chicago has basically universally panned that film and worse. So I don't live in that community, those communities, so I have to accept the fact that that's not what they... I think it's hard when your stories aren't told. Every time somebody tells a version of your story, you put so much weight on it that it can't be its own thing. It has to be a representative thing of what you need it to be. And I recognize that with United Shades. Like, if we do an episode about the Sikh community, we have to make sure that it's broad enough that we're incorporating things that they don't get to talk about, while also being specific enough that it's not just doesn't feel like a New York Times article. Like, it just feels like, here's the information. So I think it's hard for Spike Lee wanting to make a very specific movie about a thing that people have very real issues with gang life in Chicago. So I think that I would imagine history will be kinder to it than it was at the time if it looks at it just as a film. But I also think that, like, again, I think it's actually fine that artists step over the line and find out that they went too far. I think that Spike Lee has a career worth of work where we can go. If anybody's earned that, it's Spike. I also understand the criticism of the movie.
We got time for one more question.
There's one in the back in the pink hat.
Okay, hi.
Can you expand on your episode about Milwaukee? Black
Sorry.
state, white state, Wisconsin, which is a red state.
Are you from Wisconsin?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I was born
I yeah. So the Milwaukee episode, I'm always trying to get to cities. I'm always trying to get the show to go to cities that we haven't been. I'm always trying to get to areas that because we could basically do every show in New York and LA if we wanted to, because every community is represented in those places and every story is represented. So for me, it's like trying to get to different parts of America that people don't think about. And Milwaukee is one of those areas that people aren't thinking about, especially as a black city, as a city that has a huge black community. And so we also used, and it was sort of hard because they were like, let's do an episode about, this is the same thing as like, this season we're doing an episode about white supremacy. I'm a little bit like, that's every episode. And so that season was like, let's do an episode about racism. That's every episode. So, but then to sort of go to Milwaukee and tell the specific Milwaukee story and cast it against the background of all these other national stories. Things to sort of go, and it's again an episode about like, as we talked about to people in that episode, black people from Milwaukee will travel around the country and say, I'm from Wisconsin. And as the one brother said, people ask me, oh, do you have cows where you live? He's like, no, but I have drug and gang violence, or whatever. Or I have harassment from the police is what we were talking about. So the idea being that, like, putting a face on a place that people often put their own face on, and connecting it to national issues like gentrification, police brutality, structural racism in schools. And so, and also that episode was the episode where the opening of that episode is one of my favorite openings we ever did for an episode, because it was about a white guy in Oregon who, like an 18-year-old white guy in Oregon, who went to like City Hall on drugs and started a fight with like 9 police officers and lived to tell the tale. Pulled one of their guns out, shot into a wall, and got a bruise on his forehead. And I had seen that clip for a long time, and I was like, I want to do something with this clip, but I don't know what to do with it, because it was just such a clear example of white privilege, of this white guy high on drugs, wrestles 9 cops, grabs one of their guns, shoots it, and is in court with a bruise on his head later. And we contrasted that with LaCon McDonald from Chicago and Tamir Rice about like these guys, these 2 men were killed within seconds of the cops interacting with him, whereas this white guy wrestled 9 cops for 3 minutes and lived to tell the tale. And then to go to Milwaukee and tell the story of the young man whose name I'm forgetting, who was sleeping on a park bench outside of a Starbucks and was killed by a police officer for no reason. So for me, it was great to go to a place that people don't talk about enough and try to shine the spotlight on them, and also to show the work that is being done there to change the image of that city, and also to the active. There's a lot of activists in Milwaukee who are working to dismantle structural racism, and so I think it's one thing to tell the sad story, but it's another thing to actually show the work that's being done by powerful people to change the narrative. So I mean, did you have any other questions about Milwaukee with that episode? It's one of my favorite episodes because it was really hard to put together, because it felt like how are we going to talk about racism, but also make sure the voices of Milwaukee are heard. And so there's a great segment in there talking to high school kids about racism in their schools, which always leaves like people going, I can't believe that this is happening. And so for me, segments like that, like hearing them talk about how they experience racism while they're just trying to get an education. One young woman told a story about having a pickaninny, about wearing her hair in sort of braids for, it was called Wacky Wednesday, and a white teacher told her, you look like a pickaninny doll. If you don't know what that is, Google it. Super racist. And she didn't know what it was, and her teacher's like, come here, I'll look it up for you. And so she said, anyway, go back to learning. And so the idea that like sort of showing the things that people deal with on a daily basis, we think of racism as being, this is the thing about the Milwaukee episode, we often think of racism in America as being police brutality, or maybe just police brutality. We don't think of it as all the things you deal with in your life that aren't even worth telling the story about, because the stories are so small. And ultimately, most people of color and black people deal with that a lot more. And that's the racism that it's easier to dismantle, but it's also harder to prove. So that episode was about the nuances of racism, way that I really ultimately ended up I really liked that episode a lot. Thank you for the question.
Okay, so unfortunately, I think our time is up. Maybe we get the name better.
Kamau.
I know.
Kamau.
So, what's the W stand for?
Walter. Like Walter.
All right. Let me remind you, if you want to hear Kamau tonight, 6:30, Cub. Join me now in thanking him for really.